Welcome back to Gotham Trends.
Yeah.
Today we're diving deep into a topic that's been generating a lot of buzz lately.
Yeah.
The pardon of Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Oh, yeah.
You sent us a ton of material on this, articles, reports, even some personal notes, so
Right.
clearly this one hits close to home.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think what's fascinating here is that this goes beyond just Fauci himself. This pardon really kind of forces us
Yeah.
to examine the very core of public trust in our institutions, especially,
Okay.
in the wake of a global event like the pandemic.
You're right. It's not just about Fauci himself. It's about the bigger picture. It's about how decisions were made,
Right.
what information was shared or not, and where the line is drawn between scientific authority and public accountability.
Right.
But before we get into all that, let's
Yeah.
make sure we're all on the same page about Fauci's career and his
Mhm.
controversial role during the pandemic. I mean, he was a leading figure in the fight against HIV/AIDS and served as the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases for nearly 4 decades.
Yeah, exactly. He was a key advisor to multiple presidents on infectious diseases and played a particularly prominent role during the COVID-19 pandemic. And while he was, praised by some for his expertise and steady leadership, he also faced, a lot of criticism
Right.
for his handling of the pandemic,
Yeah.
particularly his evolving guidance on masks and social distancing.
In your notes, you highlighted his involvement in gain-of-function research
Right.
as a major point of contention. Can you
Yeah.
explain what that is exactly and
Sure.
why it's so controversial?
So gain-of-function research involves manipulating viruses in a lab setting
Okay.
to make them more transmissible or dangerous.
All right.
And the purpose is to study how viruses could potentially evolve and cause pandemics so that we can be better prepared. But there are obviously significant ethical and safety concerns, especially given the possibility of an accidental release.
And Fauci's connection to this type of research,
Yep.
especially through funding linked to the Wuhan Institute of Virology,
Right.
that really fueled the fire, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The Intercept obtained grant documents through a Freedom of Information Act request that
Okay.
detailed experiments on bat coronaviruses at the Wuhan lab. And some experts argue that these experiments, funded through a grant from the National Institutes of Health to EcoHealth Alliance, fit the definition of gain-of-function research.
That's right. And Fauci initially denied that the NIH funded this type of research at the Wuhan lab.
Right.
But when those grant documents came to light, it seemed to contradict his earlier statements, which
Yeah.
further eroded public trust.
Yes, exactly. This lack of transparency, coupled with the fact that the Wuhan lab was located in the same city where the pandemic is believed to have originated,
Right.
fueled a lot of speculation and conspiracy theories.
It really makes you think about the importance of open communication,
Yeah.
especially when dealing with research that carries such potential risks.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just the gain-of-function research that drew criticism. Fauci also came under fire for his changing guidance on things like masks
Right.
and vaccines. Early in the pandemic, he advised against widespread mask use, later saying it was to prevent shortages for healthcare workers. But this inconsistency confused a lot of people.
And then there's the issue of natural immunity versus vaccination. Fauci strongly advocated for vaccination, but he appeared to downplay the role of natural immunity,
Yeah.
even when studies such as those from the Cleveland Clinic demonstrated that prior infection could provide strong protection against reinfection.
Yes, you flagged those studies in your notes. And this seeming dismissal of natural immunity made some people feel like
Yeah.
public health messaging was too narrowly focused on vaccines
Right.
and didn't adequately acknowledge the complexities of individual immunity.
And this contributed to a growing narrative that public health officials weren't being entirely forthcoming or pushing a one-size-fits-all approach. Right. That failed to recognize the nuances of the situation. Not to mention, the economic and social impacts of policies like lockdowns and school closures,
Right.
which Fauci advocated for.
Right. These policies undeniably caused hardship. Businesses closed, people lost their jobs, and children experienced significant disruptions to their education.
Right.
And while the intention was to protect public health,
Yes.
the collateral damage was substantial and led to further criticism of Fauci's recommendations.
And this brings us to the heart of the pardon debate.
Yeah.
Was Fauci simply doing his best in an incredibly difficult situation, or should he be held accountable for the perceived missteps and the consequences of his actions?
It's a difficult question.
Yeah.
And the pardon itself really throws this tension into sharp relief.
Right.
We've got Arguments for the pardon,
Mm-hmm.
focusing on the need for national healing and understanding, and arguments against it, stressing the importance of accountability and transparency.
Those in favor of the pardon argue that pursuing legal action against Fauci would only prolong the division and trauma we've experienced as a country. They believe that compassion and understanding are more appropriate responses than punishment, especially considering he was working under immense pressure with incomplete information.
And from a legal standpoint, proving criminal intent in Fauci's actions would be incredibly difficult, given the complexities of scientific research and the unprecedented nature of the pandemic.
Yeah.
It would likely be a long, drawn-out legal battle
Right.
with limited prospects for achieving true accountability, not to mention the potential chilling effect it could have on experts considering government service in the future.
However, critics of the pardon argue that if Fauci misled Congress or approved funding for risky research without proper oversight,
Right.
he should be held responsible.
Mm-hmm.
They believe in upholding democratic principles and ensuring that even powerful figures are subject to the law.
You know, reading through these sources, there's a strong sense that accountability is crucial for rebuilding public trust.
Yeah.
Sweeping these issues under the rug only reinforces the perception that something is being hidden.
Precisely. Addressing these concerns head-on, even if it means holding someone like Fauci accountable,
Right.
could be a step towards restoring faith in our institutions.
And the lack of transparency throughout this entire ordeal
Right.
really fuels that mistrust. I mean, much of what we know about Fauci's actions came to light through FOIA requests and investigations by groups like Judicial Watch,
Mm-hmm.
not through proactive disclosure from the NIH.
Absolutely. This lack of transparency creates a breeding ground for suspicion and makes it incredibly difficult for the public to assess whether research is being conducted ethically and responsibly.
So we're left with these two competing narratives.
Yes.
The desire for healing and understanding versus the demand for accountability and transparency.
Right.
And the Fauci pardon really brings this conflict to the forefront.
It's like this whole situation is
Yeah.
a microcosm of a much larger debate about the role of science, government,
Right.
and public trust in our society, especially in times of crisis. And it raises some important questions about how we move forward.
Exactly. How do we ensure that scientific research is conducted ethically and transparently?
Mm-hmm.
How do we hold powerful figures accountable while also recognizing the complexities of decision-making in a crisis? And perhaps most importantly, how do we rebuild trust in public health institutions that have been so severely damaged?
Those are some seriously thought-provoking questions.
It seems like the Fauci case is about so much more than just one man. It's about the future of public health, the role of science in our society, and the very foundation of trust in our institutions.
Absolutely. These are questions we need to grapple with, not just in relation to Fauci, but for the future of public health governance as a whole.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful start to our deep dive. What does the Fauci case reveal about the state of our institutions and the challenges we face as a society? We'll continue unpacking that in part 2, right here on Gotham Trends.
You know, the Fauci case really, it exposes a fundamental tension, I think, between scientific authority and public accountability.
We rely on experts, especially during times of crisis, but we also need to make sure that power isn't being misused.
Right, and transparency and open communication become absolutely essential in these situations. When people feel like information is being withheld or manipulated, trust erodes, and that creates a breeding ground for misinformation and conspiracy theories.
And we saw that play out so dramatically during the pandemic. Social media was just flooded with conflicting narratives. It made it nearly impossible to distinguish fact from fiction.
That's incredibly dangerous because when people lose trust in credible sources of information, they often turn to less reliable sources, which can have, severe consequences for public health.
It's like a vicious cycle. Mistrust fuels misinformation, which in turn breeds further mistrust.
Absolutely. Breaking out of that cycle requires a multi-pronged approach. Scientists and public health officials need to be more transparent and proactive in their communication. They need to acknowledge uncertainty, clearly articulate their reasoning, and directly address public concerns.
And we, as citizens, also have a responsibility to be more critical consumers of information. We need to be aware of our own biases, carefully evaluate sources, and be open to changing our minds when presented with new evidence.
It's about cultivating, a healthy skepticism, not an outright rejection of expertise. We need to find that balance between questioning authority and recognizing the value of scientific knowledge.
It's like we shouldn't blindly accept everything experts say, but we also shouldn't just dismiss their expertise out of hand. It's about engaging in a thoughtful and informed dialogue.
And that dialogue needs to be inclusive of diverse perspectives. We need to ensure that the voices of marginalized communities who are often disproportionately impacted by public health crises are heard and considered.
Their experiences and insights are crucial for developing solutions that are both effective and equitable.
Absolutely. The Fauci case also highlights the need for, I think, careful consideration of the government's role in regulating scientific research. How do we balance the need for scientific advancement and discovery with the need to safeguard public safety? What level of oversight is appropriate, and who should be making those decisions?
These are complex questions, definitely no easy answers,
Right.
but they're questions we must confront. I mean, the stakes are incredibly high. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated just how vulnerable we are to emerging infectious diseases.
And it underscored the need for a robust and trustworthy public health system capable of effectively responding to these threats.
So given everything we've discussed, what concrete steps can we take to build a more resilient and trustworthy system? What lessons can we learn from the Fauci case and the pandemic more broadly?
One key takeaway, I think, is the critical importance of clear and consistent communication. Public health officials need to be upfront about what they know, what they don't know, and how they arrive at their decisions. They should avoid mixed messaging and strive for consistency in their guidance.
Because even seemingly minor inconsistencies can really erode trust, especially when people are already feeling anxious and uncertain.
Exactly. And when changes in guidance become necessary, they need to be clearly explained, acknowledging any previous errors and outlining the rationale for the shift.
Involving the public in decision-making processes is also crucial. People are more likely to trust and adhere to guidelines if they feel like they've had a voice in the process.
Transparency is paramount. Information about research funding, potential conflicts of interest, and the reasoning behind public health policies should be readily accessible to the public.
And we need to invest in independent oversight mechanisms to ensure that research is conducted ethically and responsibly.
These oversight bodies should be composed of experts from a variety of fields, including ethics, law, and public health. They should have the authority to investigate allegations of wrongdoing.
Strengthening whistleblower protections is another critical piece of the puzzle. We need to cultivate a culture where individuals feel safe coming forward with concerns without fear of retaliation.
And we can't overlook the importance of investing in, I think, public health education and outreach to combat misinformation and cultivate a more scientifically literate society.
When people understand the scientific basis for public health recommendations, they're more likely to trust and follow them.
Finally, we must address the systemic inequalities that disproportionately impact certain communities during health crises.
This means investing in healthcare infrastructure, addressing social determinants of health, and ensuring equitable access to quality care for everyone, regardless of their background or income.
These are just a few of the steps we can take to build a more resilient and trustworthy public health system. It will undoubtedly require collaborative efforts across various sectors, but it is absolutely essential for safeguarding our collective well-being.
The Fauci case, while deeply controversial, also offers an opportunity for reflection and growth.
It compels us to confront.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dives, I'm curious, what stands out to you the most from everything we've discussed? What's your biggest takeaway?
For me, it all comes back to trust. How do we rebuild trust in our institutions and in our experts?
Yeah, we've talked a lot about transparency and accountability, but is there something else, some other ingredient that's missing from the equation?
I think it's humility.
Humility.
Yeah, humility. The scientists and public health officials need to be willing to say, you know what, I was wrong, or I'm not sure yet, the evidence isn't clear. They need to be able to change their minds when new information comes to light, and they need to be able to admit when they've made a mistake.
Because digging your heels in and refusing to acknowledge mistakes just makes people lose faith.
Exactly. It sends the message that you're more interested in being right than in actually figuring out the truth. And that's a recipe for disaster, especially when you're dealing with something as complex and ever-evolving as science.
It's like science is a process, right?
Yeah.
It's about constantly questioning, testing, revising. It's not about having all the answers all the time.
Exactly. And we need to do a better job of communicating that to the public. We need to explain that uncertainty is okay, that changing your mind based on new evidence is a sign of strength, not weakness.
Because when people understand that, they're more likely to be patient with the process, to trust the journey, even if there are bumps along the way.
Absolutely. And that trust is essential for tackling the massive public health challenges we face. Infectious diseases, climate change, antibiotic resistance. These are global problems that require global cooperation, and that cooperation hinges on a shared understanding of the science.
And that shared understanding can only exist if there's trust.
Exactly.
So what can we as individuals do to cultivate that trust? I mean, it feels like such a huge, almost insurmountable task.
I think it starts with each of us taking responsibility for being informed and engaged. Ask questions. Seek out reliable sources of information. Don't just accept things at face value. Do your own research, think critically, and be willing to have respectful conversations with people who might see things differently.
It's like being open to having your mind changed.
Exactly. And be kind. We've all been through a lot these past few years, so let's try to approach these conversations with empathy and a genuine desire to understand each other's perspectives.
Well said. This has been a really fascinating deep dive. It's clear that the Fauci case goes way beyond just one man. It raises important questions about public health, about the role of science in our society, and about the importance of trust in our institutions.
And it reminds us that we all have a role to play in building a healthier and more resilient future.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and thanks for subscribing to Gotham Trends.